Effective immediately, your compensation structure is being recalibrated to align with junior analyst benchmarks, Edgar Vance said, tapping his heavy gold signet ring against the polished mahogany conference table. He did not look me in the eye. He simply slid a thin two-page addendum across the wood until it rested against my hands. That represents a 60% reduction in base salary. If you do not like it, Julian, you are welcome to turn in your key card by 5 o'clock today. Frankly, anyone with a basic business degree can do what you do. You are completely replaceable. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, feeling an icy calm settle deep into my chest. My name is Julian Reynolds. At 48 years old, I had spent 7 years serving as the senior systems and logistics architect for Valence Global. I had designed, coded, and maintained the foundational digital infrastructure that kept this multi-million-dollar supply enterprise running day in and day out across 12 Midwestern states. Yet, here sat our human resources director, casually stripping away more than half my income, with a smug smile playing across his lips, looking down at the memo. I realized Edgar was so eager to trim operational overhead before his upcoming quarterly bonus review that he had acted entirely out of blind corporate arrogance. He had not consulted internal legal counsel. He had not spoken to the board. And most importantly, he had not bothered to review the foundational framework agreements sitting inside my confidential executive personnel file. Edgar simply assumed I was just another overworked middle-aged manager, clinging desperately to a steady paycheck, far too terrified of the job market to resist. That was his very first mistake. What Edgar Vance failed to realize was that my compensation structure was never tied to a standard corporate employment template. 4 years earlier, during a chaotic corporate restructuring where the company was desperate to lock down my proprietary technical infrastructure to secure a massive municipal expansion, I had insisted on drafting a specific contingency clause. It was an executive intellectual property retention agreement embedded quietly into my master employment contract, a legally binding clause titled Appendix 4B. Under the strict terms of Appendix 4B, the core software routing engine I had built for Valence Global was provided solely under a conditional operational license. That license was directly tethered to my baseline compensation threshold of $150,000 per year and my exclusive executive authority over logistics management. The agreement explicitly stated that if the firm ever unilaterally reduced my compensation below that threshold without my express written consent or constructively altered my management role, 2 immediate legal default actions would trigger automatically. First, Valence Global's operational license to run my proprietary software engine would void instantly and automatically. Second, custodial management authority over our largest client's $40 million asset escrow account would revert directly back to my personal corporate entity as the intellectual property creator. Edgar thought he was handing me a ruthless corporate ultimatum. In reality, by demanding that I take a 60% pay cut or quit, he was legally executing the exact operational default condition I had engineered 4 years prior. By demanding my signature on that paper, he was handing me the master key to the company's absolute legal and financial collapse. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or plead for my job. I did not mention Appendix 4B, and I certainly did not correct his arrogant assumptions. Instead, I carefully unscrewed the cap of my fountain pen, placed my signature firmly on the line, acknowledging the mandatory salary reduction, and slid the paper back across the table. I looked Edgar dead in the eyes and offered him a soft, quiet smile. "I understand completely, Edgar," I said softly. "Consider it signed." Edgar smirked, tucking the document into his portfolio, entirely unaware that he had just signed away the firm's $40 million crown jewel. I picked up my phone, stood up, and walked out of his office, knowing that within days, Valence Global would be brought to its knees. As I walked down the quiet hallway toward my workspace, the reality of what had transpired settled into my mind. For 7 long years, I had poured every ounce of my energy, intellect, and personal life into Valence Global. At 48 years old, I had lived and breathed this enterprise, arriving at 6 o'clock in the morning and locking up the glass entrance doors past midnight. I had sacrificed my health, my personal life, and my peace of mind because I genuinely believed in the corporate promise. I had believed that if you worked harder than anyone else, solved impossible structural problems, and maintained unyielding professional integrity, loyalty would eventually be reciprocated. I had bought into the grand narrative repeated by executive leadership during annual retreats, that we were a family and that our shared sacrifices would lead to equity, partnerships, and financial security. My loyalty was not an empty buzzword. It was measured in blood, sweat, and endless sleepless nights. 2 years ago, when a sudden supply chain disruption threatened to plunge our entire Midwest division into immediate bankruptcy, I did not go home for 3 straight days. While Edgar Vance and the executive team slept comfortably in their suburban homes, I camped out in a windowless server bunker for 72 continuous hours. I survived on stale black coffee and energy drinks while manually rewriting our regional freight dispatch protocols, single-handedly saving our core client portfolio from catastrophic failure. Because of my sacrifice, Valence Global did not just survive that quarter. They recorded a record-breaking 22% net profit margin. When the board awarded executive bonuses that winter, Edgar Vance bought a luxury sports car and took a 2-week vacation to Europe. My reward for saving the enterprise was a standardized 3% cost of living adjustment and a printed thank you card signed by an automated stamp. Yet, I had never complained. I took on the workload of 3 separate department leads without demanding a title change or an extra dollar in base pay. I convinced myself that my technical dedication spoke for itself and that my time would come. The personal cost of that blind devotion had been devastating. I had missed my younger brother's wedding rehearsal because a server node crashed in our Chicago hub. I canceled critical medical checkups, neglected my physical well-being, and watched my personal life evaporate. Most painfully, 60-hour workweeks left me with almost no time to care for my aging mother, whose rising medical bills and specialized therapy were the primary reason I required financial stability. Every extra dollar I earned was allocated to her health care, making Edgar's sudden 60% pay cut not just a professional insult, but a direct threat to my family's survival. What upper management never understood was that while I was quietly carrying the operational weight of the company on my shoulders, I was also paying close attention. My habit of fixing system failures had forced me to master every single layer of Valance's business framework. I knew every database schema, every proprietary routing script, every vendor agreement, and every clause in our primary municipal client contracts. Out of strict professional habit, I documented every system I built. I maintained detailed, time-stamped archives of every algorithm, protocol update, and legal negotiation I conducted on the firm's behalf. I had originally built those archives to protect the company from technical failures. But as I sat down at my desk and looked at the confirmation email sitting in my inbox, a cold realization washed over me. 7 years of devotion had not earned me respect, security, or partnership. It had only made me a prime target for a greedy human resources director looking to pad his quarterly metrics. The corporate family was a myth, and my loyalty had been squandered on men who viewed me as nothing more than an expense line item on a spreadsheet. I opened my desk drawer, pulled out my private ledger, and turned to the section labeled Contractual Frameworks and Intellectual Property. It was time to stop being the devoted corporate officer who absorbed every blow. It was time to examine the legal architecture I had constructed 4 years ago and prepare to show Edgar Vance what happens when you attempt to destroy the architect of your own foundation. What corporate management failed to comprehend in their rush to cut costs was a fundamental operational reality of Valance Global. I did not simply manage our digital logistics framework. I had built it line by line from the ground up. Over my 7 years at the firm, I had designed, coded, and deployed our proprietary automated routing engine, a complex software architecture known internally as Project Vault. Project Vault was the beating heart of the entire corporate enterprise. It calculated real-time transit variables, predicted supply chain bottlenecks, managed inventory distribution across 12 states, and automatically adjusted freight channels before regional delays could occur. Without Project Vault, Valence Global was nothing more than a glorified freight broker with a collection of trucks and a mounting list of liabilities. The undisputed crown jewel of our business portfolio was our master agreement with the Tri-State Transit Authority. It was a massive $40 million municipal contract that managed public transit and heavy supply infrastructure across 3 major metropolitan regions. Securing that contract had taken nearly 2 years of intense negotiation. The client board had made one requirement explicitly clear from the beginning. They were not placing their trust in Valence Global's executive officers. They were placing their trust in me and my technical framework. Because the tri-state contract involved such a staggering amount of public funds, the Municipal Transit Board required strict operational safeguards before committing their capital into custodial escrow accounts. They needed absolute legal assurance that the underlying software architecture would remain stable, secure, and maintained by its original creator. That was where Appendix 4B had come into play. 4 years prior, during a volatile corporate restructuring, Valence Global was desperate to finalize the tri-state deal. To ensure my long-term technical commitment and protect my personal intellectual property rights, I had worked with an independent contract attorney to draft a specific retention agreement. That agreement contained Appendix 4B, a clause that the executive board treated as routine legal fluff during a late-night signing session. The executives were so focused on claiming their immediate commission bonuses that they signed the legal documentation without reading the fine print. Appendix 4B explicitly detailed the legal terms under which Valence Global was granted an operational license to use Project Vault. The conditions were crystal clear. Valence was granted an exclusive, non-transferable license to run my proprietary routing system provided that 2 specific conditions were continuously met. First, my baseline executive compensation could never drop below my established threshold of $150,000 per year. Second, my executive authority over the tri-state project and system architecture could not be altered, reduced, or reassigned without my express written consent. The clause went on to state the exact legal consequences if Valence ever breached those terms. If the firm unilaterally reduced my salary, altered my executive role, or constructively forced my departure, the operational license for Project Vault would void immediately and automatically. At that exact moment, full copyright ownership of the core source code would revert entirely back to my private corporate holding entity. Furthermore, Appendix 4B contained a direct escrow mandate linked with the Commercial Holding Bank, managing the Tri-State Transit Authority's $40 million operational account. In the event of a material breach of my employment contract, custodial authority over the escrow account would instantly freeze, transferring sole administrative management rights to an independent administrator, designated by the intellectual property creator, which was me. Edgar Vance had no idea this legal landmine was sitting inside my personnel file. He saw a senior manager earning a respectable salary and calculated that stripping 60% of my pay would look fantastic on his quarterly overhead reduction report. He thought he was playing a shrewd game of corporate hardball, assuming I would meekly accept the pay cut out of fear or quietly search for another job while continuing to work for pennies. What Edgar did not realize was that by sliding that salary reduction addendum across the table and demanding my signature under threat of termination, he had formally executed the exact contractual breach required to activate Appendix 4B. He had not saved the company a single cent. He had set off an unstoppable legal sequence that would strip Valence of its primary software engine and lock them out of their $40 million client account. I sat at my desk, opened my private laptop, and accessed an encrypted drive containing notarized copies of Appendix 4B, the signed salary cut memo, and the original federal copyright registrations for Project Vault. My hands were perfectly steady. The trap was officially set, and Edgar Vance had pulled the trigger himself. If Edgar Vance's salary cut was a calculated financial insult, what took place on Monday morning was a deliberate attempt at professional execution. At 9 o'clock sharply, an all-hands emergency meeting was called in the main executive boardroom. Nearly 30 department heads, senior logistics leads, and operations analysts crammed into the room, exchanging puzzled expressions. Edgar stood at the head of the conference table, wearing a triumphant grin that practically radiated self-congratulation. Beside him stood a young man, in his early 20s wearing an ill-fitting designer suit, leaning casually against the whiteboard with an air of unearned supreme confidence. "Thank you all for coming," Edgar announced, his voice echoing through the boardroom speakers. "As part of our aggressive commitment to modernizing Valance Global and streamlining our operational efficiency, we are making some exciting leadership adjustments today. Effective immediately, I want to introduce Brandon Vance, our new Senior Director of Operations." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Brandon was 24 years old, fresh out of college with a basic communications degree, and possessed precisely zero experience in complex municipal logistics, database engineering, or freight routing. What Edgar conveniently omitted from his speech, though everyone in the building already knew, was that Brandon happened to be the favorite nephew of Valance Global's chairman of the board. Edgar turned his cold eyes directly toward me, ensuring everyone in the room noticed. In light of this strategic leadership upgrade, Edgar continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "Julian Reynolds will be stepping down from his former architecture duties. To assist with the transition, Julian will spend the next few weeks assisting Brandon and training him on our basic daily protocols." Then came the final turn of the corporate knife. Edgar leaned forward, resting his hands on the podium. "Due to ongoing space reallocation on the executive floor, Julian's workspace has been relocated to Office 104B on the basement level, adjacent to the physical paper archives. We expect full cooperation from everyone during this exciting phase of growth." Office 104B was not an actual office. It was a windowless storage closet located next to the building's main boiler room, filled with discarded office furniture and boxes of decade-old tax records. Edgar was not just cutting my pay and handing my title to the chairman's unqualified nephew. He was physically banishing me to the basement to publicly humiliate me in front of the entire staff. Brandon took the microphone, offering an arrogant smirk. "I am really looking forward to bringing modern agile thinking to this department," he announced loudly, chuckling. "Looking over the existing infrastructure, it is clear to me that we have been relying on dinosaur systems and manual documentation for far too long. Honestly, any basic automation tool can handle what is currently in place. I plan on optimizing 7 years of old work in less than 48 hours." I watched my junior colleagues avert their eyes in uncomfortable pity. I saw a few department leads bite their lips, horrified by the sheer disrespect being displayed. Edgar sat back down at the head of the table, nodding proudly, as if he had just orchestrated a masterclass in corporate leadership. A few years ago, a public humiliation like this would have devastated me. I would have felt an overwhelming urge to defend my professional reputation, list my technical achievements, or fight back against Brandon's outrageous arrogance. But as I sat in that boardroom watching Edgar and Brandon celebrate their stolen victory, a strange calm settled over me. The last lingering thread of emotional attachment I held for Valance Global snapped clean. The hurt, the fatigue, and the desire for recognition vanished completely, replaced by an ice-cold focus. I did not interrupt Brandon. I did not roll my eyes, object to my reassignment, or raise my voice. When the meeting adjourned, I stood up calmly, gathered my ledger, and looked Brandon directly in the eyes. "Welcome aboard, Brandon," I said with a polite tone. "I will be down in Office 104B whenever you are ready to begin your training." I turned around and walked toward the basement elevators, ready to execute the final steps of my exit strategy. The basement storage room was cold, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of damp cardboard. But for 5 straight days, it served as my strategic headquarters. Above me on the 3rd floor, Brandon spent his afternoons pacing the carpeted halls, making loud personal phone calls, and boasting to junior analysts about his impending executive promotion. He did not come down to the archives a single time. He genuinely believed that running a $40 million municipal supply network required nothing more than an executive title and an inflated sense of self-worth. I did not waste a single second feeling bitter. Sitting at a small wooden folding table beside stacks of archived financial files, I opened my personal laptop and established a secure connection to an external network. I initiated a private video call with my personal corporate attorney, Bernard Cross, to review my employment file step by step. Bernard carefully examined the documents displayed on his screen, scrolling through the original framework agreements, federal copyright registrations for Project Vault, and the signed salary reduction memo Edgar had handed me the previous week. "Julian, this is almost astonishingly clean," Bernard remarked, shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "Edgar Vance provided you with written, signed proof of a unilateral 60% salary reduction without cause. In doing so, he legally executed the default condition of Appendix 4B. They did not just breach your contract, they handed you total legal authority to revoke their operational software license. What management did not understand was that I was not interested in making a dramatic public scene, throwing a tantrum, or attempting unauthorized system sabotage. True power in the business world does not come from emotional outbursts. It comes from unyielding legal precision and meticulous preparation. Over the next 48 hours, Bernard and I assembled every required piece of verified documentation. We gathered notarized copies of Appendix 4B, my original software copyright filings, and the Master Escrow Management Framework governing the Tri-State Transit Authority account. On Thursday morning, Bernard officially served a formal notice of license revocation directly to the Chief Legal Officer of the Tri-State Transit Authority, as well as the Executive Board of the Commercial Holding Bank managing the $40 million asset escrow. The legal notice was devastatingly clear. It informed both the bank and the client that Valance Global's operational rights to Project Vault were officially terminated due to a material breach of primary licensing conditions. Because the software engine could no longer legally run under Valance's corporate banner, custodial authority over the $40 million escrow account was immediately frozen, pending administrative transfer to an authorized entity designated by the intellectual property owner. Simultaneously, I completed the final incorporation paperwork for my own independent enterprise, Nexus Systems. I ensured that every compliance framework, tax structure, and operational liability insurance policy was impeccably aligned. Nexus Systems was ready to step in as a fully licensed, standalone enterprise the moment Valance Global collapsed under its own weight. Upstairs, Brandon continued to ignore his transition duties completely. When he occasionally sent me a dismissive email asking where the system manuals were kept, I politely directed him to a public shared drive containing basic user guides from 3 years prior. The exact documentation Brandon had arrogantly claimed was all he needed to automate my job. I did not hide anything, nor did I alter a single line of source code. I simply allowed Brandon's own lazy arrogance to dictate his fate. By Friday afternoon, my preparations were absolute. The legal notices were logged. The bank escrow was locked in a conditional freeze, and Nexus Systems was fully operational. At 4:55 in the afternoon, as the rest of the building was packing up for the weekend, I walked up to the 3rd floor one final time. Edgar's office was empty. He had already left early for a weekend golf retreat. I walked over to his mahogany desk, placed my formal letter of resignation directly on his keyboard, and laid my electronic keycard beside it. I did not pack a box, and I did not say goodbye to anyone. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the ground floor button, and watched the doors close smoothly. As I stepped out into the crisp evening air, I knew that, when the corporate servers executed their automated Monday morning routines, Valance Global would collide headfirst with reality. The operational fallout hit Valance Global on Tuesday morning with catastrophic, irreversible force. Expecting a smooth dispatch cycle, Brandon strolled into the executive suite at 9:30 in the morning, carrying a gourmet coffee and ready to execute the monthly regional logistics manifest for the Tri-State Transit Authority. He logged into the main administrative terminal and initiated the Project Vault processing pipeline. What Brandon did not understand was that my formal resignation on Friday evening had triggered the automated license revocation protocol hard-coded into the software framework. Upon detecting the termination of my baseline executive credentials, Project Vault automatically locked down its core processing engine, dropping the entire enterprise network into read-only standby mode. Instead of seeing the familiar green operational dashboard, Brandon was met with a stark black screen displaying a system-level security block. Panicking and lacking even the most basic understanding of database architecture, Brandon attempted to force an administrative override using generic system commands. That was his second catastrophic mistake. Attempting to bypass the license check without the master cryptographic key triggered Project Vault's automated security countermeasures. Within seconds, the system locked down every regional dispatch server across 3 Midwestern states, freezing all real-time routing schedules and blocking manual data entries. By 10:15 in the morning, absolute chaos erupted across the regional transport corridor. Hundreds of municipal transit vehicles, cargo trucks, and maintenance fleets were paralyzed at depot stations without updated deployment manifests or automated routing guidance. Traffic grids in 3 major metropolitan centers began grinding to a halt as dispatch managers screamed into their radios, completely unable to move vehicles without system authorization. Simultaneously, the chief executive officer of the Tri-State Transit Authority called Valence Global's executive suite in an absolute fury. He demanded to know why their entire regional transit network was paralyzed and why their financial department had just received an urgent alert from the holding bank stating that their $40 million operational escrow account had been placed on an immediate administrative freeze. Edgar Vance was pulled out of a morning budget meeting and rushed into the main executive conference room, his face pale and covered in cold sweat. He frantically ordered the internal technical department to override the software lockdown, but the lead network engineer shook his head in terror. "We cannot touch it, Edgar," the engineer reported, his voice trembling. "The core routing algorithm is not owned by Valence. It is built on a proprietary external framework, and the source code is entirely encrypted. The system is not broken. It is executing a legal license lock." Desperate to avoid a complete corporate collapse, Edgar summoned Valence Global's chief legal counsel, demanding that they file an immediate lawsuit against me for system sabotage. But when the senior corporate attorneys pulled my master personnel file and reviewed the notarized copy of Appendix 4B alongside Edgar's signed salary cut memo, the room went dead silent. The head of legal looked across the table at Edgar with pure disbelief and horror. "Edgar, what on earth did you do?" the attorney whispered, his voice trembling with anger. "Appendix 4B is an ironclad, binding intellectual property agreement signed by our founding partners 4 years ago. By forcing Julian Reynolds to take a 60% pay cut, you personally executed a material breach of contract that automatically revoked our software license and locked us out of the Tri-State escrow account. He did not sabotage anything. You handed him the legal right to shut us down." Total panic gripped the executive board as the full magnitude of Edgar's blunder became painfully clear. In his desperate, arrogant rush to trim operational costs and claim a quarterly bonus, Edgar Vance had effectively destroyed the company's primary revenue engine, paralyzed a major public transit network, and handed total control of a $40 million account to the very man he had banished to the basement archives. Edgar collapsed into his executive chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably, as he stared at the glowing red error screens filling the conference room monitors. The corporate attorneys closed their folders, looked at the terrified board of directors, and delivered the final brutal truth. There was only one person on planet Earth who held the cryptographic keys and legal authority to unlock the $40 million system, and Edgar had told him he was completely played just 7 days ago. By Wednesday morning at 7 o'clock sharp, the corporate arrogance that had defined Valence Global for 7 years had vanished completely, replaced by frantic, uncontrolled panic. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, enjoying a quiet cup of coffee, when my personal cell phone began vibrating endlessly against the granite surface. I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. There were 14 missed calls from Edgar Vance and a barrage of frantic text messages. Edgar had dropped his smug boardroom persona entirely. His text messages ranged from hysterical demands to immediate legal threats, accusing me of breach of corporate duty, unlawful system interference, and intentional corporate espionage. He claimed Valance's legal department was preparing an emergency court injunction to force me back into the office. I did not bother typing out a response. Instead, I forwarded the messages directly to my attorney, Bernard Cross. Within 10 minutes, Bernard sent Edgar's legal team a single formal email containing 2 attachments: the notarized copy of Appendix 4B and the salary reduction memo signed by Edgar's own hand. Bernard added a brief 1-sentence note: any further harassment of my client will result in immediate civil litigation for constructive dismissal, intentional tortious interference, and breach of executive contract. Realizing that empty legal threats were completely useless against an ironclad contract, upper management at Valance shifted tactics immediately. At 8:15 in the morning, my phone rang again. This time it was not Edgar. It was Walter Miller, the managing director of Valance Global and Edgar's direct superior. When I answered, Walter's voice was trembling with visible anxiety. "Julian," he began, his tone breathless and apologetic, "I am calling you personally because there has been a monumental, tragic misunderstanding within our organization. I was just made aware of Edgar's reckless actions regarding your compensation, and I want to assure you that his decisions do not reflect the values or intentions of this company." "It was not a misunderstanding, Walter," I replied calmly, setting my coffee cup down. "Edgar handed me a 60% pay cut, told me anyone with a basic degree could do my job, and banished me to a basement archive room while giving my responsibilities to the chairman's nephew. Edgar acted completely outside his authority." Walter interjected frantically, desperate to throw his human resources director under the bus to save the firm. "Julian, please listen to me. If you come back to the office today, unlock Project Vault, and restore access to the Tri-State escrow account, I will personally guarantee full reinstatement of your senior architect position. Not only will we restore your original salary, but the board has authorized me to offer you an immediate $200,000 annual retention bonus." When I remained silent, Walter panicked even further, escalating the offer. "We will give you a full senior partner title, Julian. Direct equity vesting right now." I listened to his frantic pleading, remembering the dark, windowless basement room filled with broken furniture. I remembered Edgar's smug smirk as he tapped his signet ring, and Brandon boasting that my 7 years of work were nothing more than dinosaur systems easily replaced by basic automation tools. "Walter," I said softly, my voice completely steady, 4 days ago, your company decided I was worth 60% less than what I had earned through 7 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. You told me I was completely replaceable. I suggest you let Brandon replace me." Before Walter could reply, I quietly ended the call. At 11 o'clock that morning, an emergency joint conference call was convened between the board of directors at the Tri-State Transit Authority, the executive board of Valance Global, and my legal team at Nexus Systems. Walter Miller spent the first 15 minutes trying to spin the catastrophic network shutdown as a temporary technical glitch and a tragic internal communication breakdown. However, the chairman of the Tri-State Transit Board, a sharp, no-nonsense executive named Winston Drake, cut Walter off mid-sentence. "Walter, save your excuses," Winston said sternly over the speakerphone. "We have thoroughly reviewed the underlying framework agreement. Valance Global committed a direct material breach of contract by altering the baseline management terms of the primary system architect. Because of your gross executive negligence, municipal transit across 3 states was paralyzed for over 24 hours. Winston turned his attention to my line. "Julian, as the sole intellectual property creator of Project Vault and the designated administrator under Appendix 4B, do you confirm that Valance Global no longer holds a valid operational software license?" "I confirm it, Winston," I stated clearly. "Valance Global's license was formally revoked upon my resignation due to material contract breach." "That is all we need to hear," Winston declared. "Under Clause 12 of our Master Service Agreement, the Tri-State Transit Authority is formally terminating its relationship with Valance Global for cause effective immediately. We are exercising our legal authority to transfer management of our $40 million operational escrow account directly to Nexus Systems. Walter Miller sat in stunned silence on the line as Edgar Vance listened beside him, realizing his arrogant cost-cutting maneuver had just cost Valence Global its flagship $40 million account and destroyed the firm's industry standing forever. The ultimate victory was not celebrated with loud arguments, angry confrontations, or petty gloating. It was won quietly, professionally, and completely through the undeniable power of technical competence and legal foresight. 3 weeks after the tri-state contract was officially severed from Valence Global, Nexus Systems opened its new corporate headquarters. We moved into a bright, modern office suite on the 24th floor of a premier downtown commercial tower, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the city skyline. The space was filled with natural sunlight, high energy, and clear purpose, a stark, beautiful contrast to the windowless basement storage room Edgar Vance had banished me to just 1 month earlier. My first official act as president and chief executive officer of Nexus Systems was to reach out to 3 former colleagues from Valence Global. They were brilliant, hard-working professionals, senior data analysts and logistics managers who had spent years working 70-hour weeks while being constantly overlooked, underpaid, and passed over for promotion by Edgar's toxic corporate network. I brought all 3 of them into my new office and offered them senior leadership positions at double their previous salaries, complete with comprehensive health benefits, flexible working schedules, and real equity stakes in Nexus Systems. Tears filled their eyes as they signed their new employment agreements, realizing that their days of being exploited by an unappreciative corporate machine were finally over. With a dedicated, loyal team operating Project Vault under a fully optimized framework, Nexus Systems thrived almost immediately. Within 6 months, news of our flawless operational transition and unyielding commitment to security spread throughout the municipal logistics sector. 4 additional regional transit authorities, impressed by our track record and ethical leadership, severed their ties with legacy providers and signed long-term service agreements with Nexus Systems, expanding our managed asset portfolio past $75 million. Meanwhile, the structural collapse at Valence Global was swift, brutal, and devastating. Stripped of their $40 million crown jewel and facing severe reputational damage across the industry, the company's executive board launched an emergency forensic audit into the events leading up to the disaster. The audit revealed the full extent of Edgar Vance's reckless arrogance. The board discovered that Edgar had unilaterally forced my 60% pay cut without legal review, purely to pad his own quarterly cost reduction metrics and claim a personal performance bonus. The fallout was immediate. Edgar Vance was publicly terminated for gross incompetence, breach of fiduciary duty, and severe corporate mismanagement. His professional reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that no major firm in the industry would even consider hiring him. Brandon Vance, the chairman's nephew, who had arrogantly claimed he could optimize 7 years of my work in less than 48 hours, was quietly stripped of his title and permanently ousted from the logistics sector altogether. Deprived of its primary revenue driver and buried under client lawsuits, Valence Global was forced to liquidate half its operational assets and downsize its remaining workforce significantly just to avoid complete bankruptcy. I never took pleasure in their downfall, nor did I spend a single moment looking back in bitterness. I did not need to actively destroy Edgar Vance or Valence Global. I simply built a legal and technical framework that allowed their own arrogance, greed, and disrespect to destroy them naturally. Sitting at my desk in my new corner office, watching my team collaborate with genuine enthusiasm and mutual respect, I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace and professional pride. I thought back to the man who had spent 7 years sacrificing his health, his family time, and his dignity for a corporate machine that viewed him as easily replaceable. I realized then that the true victory was not just taking back the $40 million contract or building a successful independent enterprise. The true victory was discovering my own worth, standing firm in my dignity, and proving that when an underestimated man knows his value, no toxic corporate system on earth can ever hold him down.